By the autumn of 1968, the United States found itself at a crucial juncture in Southeast Asia. Earlier that year, the Communist forces had suffered a significant defeat during the Tet Offensive, yet they had achieved a substantial psychological triumph. Although American troop numbers were at a record high and there was much talk of a light at the end of the tunnel, the scale and intensity of the Communist assaults were shocking. Calls to withdraw from Vietnam grew louder than ever. A rattled Lyndon Johnson declared he wouldn't seek re-election. Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon entered a battle for the soon-to-be-opened White House. Nixon made the war in Vietnam a central theme of his campaign, vowing to provide new leadership that will end the war and win peace in the Pacific. He asserted that the nation's goal should be to support the South Vietnamese in their fight rather than fight on their behalf. If they didn't shoulder most of the responsibility for their own defense, they wouldn't survive. Despite his later claims to the contrary, these statements led many voters to believe Nixon had a secret plan for ending the conflict, which likely contributed to his electoral victory in November. On January 20, 1969, Richard Milhous Nixon was inaugurated as the 37th President of the United States. After taking office, Nixon was met with the same challenges in Vietnam that Lyndon Johnson had faced. The escalation and increase of American troops had proven ineffective, a reality highlighted by the Tet Offensive. The resulting stalemate was unacceptable, not just for those demanding a withdrawal, but also for a growing segment of Americans who had once supported the war but could no longer accept an open-ended commitment to what seemed like an unwinnable conflict. The solution was to exit Vietnam, but the challenge lay in creating a strategy that would allow the United States to withdraw gracefully while not leaving South Vietnam to the Communists. On his first day in office, Nixon quickly sought a solution by issuing the National Security Study Memorandum 1, called Situation in Vietnam. This was sent to select members of his new administration, asking for input on 29 key questions and 50 additional queries within 6 main areas: negotiations, the enemy situation, the state of South Vietnam's armed forces, the pacification effort, the political landscape in South Vietnam, and American objectives. This memorandum reached various key players, including the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and Headquarters Military Assistance Command Vietnam. According to Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, the purpose was to clarify any differences so they could identify contentious issues and varying viewpoints. Nixon's primary concerns revolved around the stability of the Thieu government and the South Vietnamese's ability to continue fighting after any U.S. troop withdrawal. If he was looking for a mix of opinions on the war, he certainly found them through the diverse responses to what became known as the 29 questions. Kissinger and his team compiled these responses into a 44-page report, which showed that most participants believed the Republic of Vietnam could not defend itself against both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army anytime soon. Similarly, most felt the government of Vietnam likely couldn't withstand significant political challenges from the National Liberation Front. They acknowledged that despite suffering heavy losses during the Tet Offensive, the enemy remained a formidable force capable of reinforcements from North Vietnam. Yet, while they agreed on these issues, opinions diverged regarding the progress made so far and the long-term outlook for Southeast Asia. 2 opposing perspectives emerged. The more optimistic view was represented by the MAPV response and echoed by Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker in Saigon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Admiral John S. McCain, Jr. The commander of U.S. Pacific Forces stated that the North Vietnamese had accepted peace talks in Paris due to their military shortcomings, believing that the progress made in pacification was genuine and likely to last, and that conditions were favorable. While the MACV highlighted the strides being made in modernizing the ARVN, it cautioned that the South Vietnamese were not yet capable of defending against a coordinated assault, emphasizing that the RVNAF simply cannot achieve the level of self-sufficiency and overwhelming force needed to counter both the Viet Cong insurgency and main force offensives from the North Vietnamese Army. As a result, General Creighton W. Abrams, Jr., head of MATV, insisted that any consideration of American troop withdrawal must coincide with a North Vietnamese withdrawal from South Vietnam. In stark contrast, the State Department, CIA, and some civilians in the Defense Department presented a much more pessimistic outlook, questioning Saigon's military effectiveness and the progress made by the U.S. The Defense Department even asserted that the South Vietnamese could not sustain efforts against the Viet Cong, let alone a combined threat, without ongoing and full American support. They shared the belief that the claimed successes in pacification were overstated and fragile, and argued that the communists weren't negotiating out of weakness. Rather, they were seeking political and strategic advantages by talking in Paris. Thus, there were two conflicting viewpoints regarding the future of South Vietnam and its military. What was intended to clarify the Vietnam situation and help develop a viable strategy only complicated matters further for the new president. Henry Kissinger noted, "The answers to NSSM-1 revealed a lack of consensus on the facts and even less agreement on policy." Consequently, Nixon faced a significant dilemma. He had pledged to end the war and bring the troops home, but as Kissinger later noted in his memoirs, it wasn't as simple as just switching channels. The new president needed to craft an exit strategy that would extract the United States from Vietnam without merely abandoning the situation. While ensuring the survival of South Vietnam was important, it clearly wasn't the main priority. The main focus was getting the U.S. out of the conflict. Nixon and his team began exploring ways to disengage from the war while still offering the South Vietnamese a fighting chance after the Americans left. They recognized this task would not be simple and might even be impossible in the long run. Despite the challenges in bolstering the South Vietnamese military, the president and his key advisors, particularly Defense Secretary Melvin R. Laird and Secretary of State William P. Rogers, agreed this was the only viable option for the U.S. to exit Vietnam. Nixon instructed American representatives to take a bold approach to persuade President Thieu and the South Vietnamese government to take greater responsibility for the war. While it was never stated outright, everyone understood that the South Vietnamese assuming more combat duties would precede the withdrawal of American troops, which had swelled to 543,000 by that time. To gain a clearer understanding of the situation on the ground in Southeast Asia, Nixon ordered Laird to visit South Vietnam for a first-hand evaluation. On March 5, 1969, Laird, joined by General Earl Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, arrived in Saigon. There, they received briefings from senior MAFV officers who insisted that significant progress was being made within the South Vietnamese forces. Laird instructed General Abrams to accelerate efforts so that the majority of the military responsibilities could be handed over to the Saigon forces as swiftly as possible. Abrams reiterated his earlier caution that the South Vietnamese were not ready to stand alone against a united threat. Nonetheless, Laird, under pressure from home, directed Abrams to enhance the RVNAF and transfer control of the war to them before the new administration's time ran out. As historian Louis Sorley highlights, this wasn't a new task for Abrams. He had been involved in this mission since he served under Westmoreland in Saigon. However, the sense of urgency was a new element. In spite of Abrams's caution, Laird returned to Washington firmly believing that the South Vietnamese could ultimately take over the entire war effort, allowing for a full U.S. withdrawal. Laird, a former Republican congressman with 17 years in the House, felt an urgent need to conclude the war. He understood that the traditional grace period granted to a new president by the public, media, and Congress after an election would be fleeting. With anti-war sentiment surging on Capitol Hill, Laird recognized that Nixon would face significant backlash if he didn't act swiftly to end the conflict. Laird believed that continuing the war in Vietnam would undermine American strength and credibility globally, especially in regions more critical to U.S. security than Southeast Asia. He felt that prolonging the conflict could spark turmoil and controversy, seriously hindering Nixon's chances of achieving a respectable resolution. Therefore, as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Jerry Friedheim noted, Laird was more focused on bringing the Vietnam War to a close rather than winning it. He advised Nixon that the president had no alternative but to hand over the war to the South Vietnamese in order to withdraw U.S. forces and soothe both the rising anti-war movement and the growing number of Americans who simply wanted the war to end. Laird proposed a strategy focused on strengthening the South Vietnamese armed forces so they could manage the ongoing insurgency and the persistent North Vietnamese presence in the South. He argued that the large U.S. military presence hindered the South Vietnamese's ability to take initiative and assume control of the war effort. Laird informed Nixon that he believed the focus of American senior commanders in Vietnam was more about military operations than empowering the South Vietnamese to defend themselves. He urged the U.S. military leaders in South Vietnam to shift their priorities from combat to preparing the South Vietnamese for self-reliance. As part of this plan, he recommended withdrawing 50,000 to 70,000 American troops in 1969. During a National Security Council meeting on March 28th, the President and his advisors considered Laird's proposals. General Andrew Goodpaster, who was then General Abrams' deputy in Saigon, informed the President about the notable progress made by the South Vietnamese forces, mentioning that MAFI was close to de-Americanizing the conflict. Henry Kissinger recounted that Laird took issue with Goodpaster's wording and proposed the term Vietnamization to better highlight the key points. Shortly thereafter, this term became synonymous with Nixon's strategy to transfer the war responsibilities to the South Vietnamese. Laird later explained to the House Armed Services Committee that the goal of the new initiative was to enable the RVNAF to take on a larger share of combat roles from American troops, facilitating the substantial withdrawal of U.S. forces. These remarks were clearly tailored to gain support for the new policy among Congress and the American people. Alexander M. Haig, who was part of Nixon's national security staff at the time, described Laird's initiative as a stroke of public relations genius, although he noted that it was aimed at appeasing American critics of the war rather than establishing an effective defense strategy for South Vietnam. Still, according to Henry Kissinger, Laird wholeheartedly believed that Vietnamization would succeed, making it his top priority. Nixon quickly embraced Laird's arguments, later stating that it was Laird's enthusiastic support that led to the adoption of Vietnamization. It didn't take much to persuade the president. Haig noted that Nixon had already begun discussing troop withdrawals shortly after taking office, and Laird's Vietnamization plan offered the justification he needed. This plan would allow Nixon to start reducing U.S. combat operations with the ultimate aim of full withdrawal. However, he understood that American forces could not exit too hastily. Despite improvements in South Vietnam, significant fighting remained. Time was essential to strengthen the RVNAF to continue the fight independently. Therefore, American forces had to persist with combat operations to allow for the necessary buildup of South Vietnamese capabilities. In early April 1969, President Nixon set forth his planning guidance for a new policy through National Security Study Memorandum 36. This memorandum called for the development of a detailed timetable for Vietnamizing the war, concentrating on all facets of U.S. military, paramilitary, and civilian involvement in Vietnam, covering combat troops, advisory personnel, and all types of equipment. The main goal of this plan was to gradually shift the burden of fighting from American forces to South Vietnamese ones. Nixon's instructions rested on several key assumptions. First, it was presumed that if the Paris peace talks stalled, any withdrawal of U.S. troops would be unilateral, without corresponding reductions from the North Vietnamese army. This marked a significant shift from prior beliefs, indicating that the South Vietnamese forces would have to confront both the Viet Cong and the NVA. Second, troop withdrawals would follow a cut-and-try method, with General Abrams evaluating the impact of each phase before proceeding with the next round of reductions. Third, there was an expectation that South Vietnamese forces would be ready to take on more military responsibilities. Consequently, the presence of American troops in South Vietnam would be reduced to a point where only a minimal support and advisory mission would remain. Despite assessments from various government agencies indicating that the South Vietnamese armed forces could not withstand a combined VC-NVA challenge, The Nixon administration developed a strategy to prepare them for that very scenario, instructing U.S. command in Saigon to create plans for fully transferring the war effort to South Vietnam. All that remained was to announce this new approach to the public. On June 8, 1969, President Nixon met with South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu at Midway and for the first time publicly unveiled the American policy of Vietnamization. He announced that there would be a consistent enhancement and buildup of South Vietnamese forces and institutions, combined with increased military pressure on the enemy, while American troops would be gradually withdrawn. Nixon highlighted that the ultimate goal was to strengthen the capabilities of the RVNAF and support the Thieu government, empowering the South Vietnamese to independently resist the communists. Before wrapping up, Nixon declared he would withdraw 25,000 troops and mentioned that he would continue to pull out more at regular intervals. He stated that this reduction of U.S. forces depended on three key factors: the progress in training and equipping the South Vietnamese forces, advancements in the Paris negotiations, and the level of enemy activity. Privately, President Thieu was troubled by Nixon's announcement. Nixon noted that Thieu, understanding the implications of the U.S. withdrawals, was deeply concerned. However, Nixon claimed he assured Thieu through Ambassador Bunker that American support would remain strong. Thieu and many of his generals were also unhappy with another aspect of Vietnamization, the term itself. They found the concept offensive, suggesting the ARVN was finally stepping up to take on the war's responsibilities. For those South Vietnamese who had battled the communists since the 1950s, the idea of Vietnamization felt demeaning. A former ARVN general reflected after the war that it was their own fight, and they were prepared to continue whether or not American troops were present. He believed Vietnamization was not an appropriate term for the situation, especially given the role of propaganda as an enemy tactic. Despite these sensitivities, Henry Kissinger noted that Nixon was thrilled, viewing the announcement as a political success that would provide him with the time needed to develop his strategy. A subsequent memo showed that Nixon hoped his new policy of Vietnamizing the war would signal to the American public that he had dismissed a purely U.S. solution and had a plan to conclude the conflict. To solidify this new strategy, Nixon met with Laird and General Wheeler after returning from Midway to discuss a shift in General Abrams' mission. The existing mission statement from President Johnson had tasked MAC-CV with defeating the enemy and forcing their withdrawal back to North Vietnam. Following the discussions after the Midway announcement, a new directive issued to Abrams took effect on August 15th. It mandated him to offer maximum assistance to bolster the South Vietnamese armed forces, enhance support for the pacification efforts, and lessen the supply flow to the enemy along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This order formalized the initiative that General Abrams had begun upon taking command of MAP-V, transforming it into official White House policy. Nixon's new strategy aimed at shifting the responsibility of combat to the South Vietnamese, while Henry Kissinger engaged in efforts in Paris to secure a ceasefire and subsequent peace deal. Thus, Nixon sought to withdraw the United States from Southeast Asia while achieving peace with honor. The Vietnamization process was set to unfold in three phases. The first phase centered on gradually transferring the primary combat responsibilities against Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces to the RVNAF, with the United States continuing to provide air, naval, and logistical support. The second phase focused on building the RVNAF's capabilities to promote self-reliance through enhanced artillery, air, naval resources, and other support services. This second phase ran concurrently with the first but required more time. Even after most U.S. combat troops were pulled out, American forces would keep offering support, security, and training personnel. The third phase aimed to downscale the American presence to a strictly advisory role, with a small security team remaining for protection. It was anticipated that the advisory presence would decrease gradually as South Vietnam gained strength. However, the strategy, at least as it was originally outlined, included maintaining a small residual force in South Vietnam for some time to come, as Laird informed a House subcommittee in February 1970. Many South Vietnamese interpreted such statements as a promise that the United States would not abandon them. As the calls for a full U.S. withdrawal intensified, the idea of a residual American force in Vietnam would eventually be forsaken, leading to dire consequences for South Vietnam's situation. As the United States continued its combat operations, the new Vietnamization policy placed a strong emphasis on modernizing and developing the South Vietnamese armed forces. This wasn't a completely new effort. In the earlier years of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, especially between 1965 and 1967, it had taken a backseat and military leaders concentrated on U.S. unit operations. However, with Richard Nixon's election and his focus on Vietnamization, enhancing and modernizing the South Vietnamese forces became a top priority for MACV. During a meeting with President Thieu at Midway in June 1969, where Nixon announced the start of the Vietnamization policy, Thieu voiced serious concerns about the readiness of his forces, given the upcoming U.S. troop withdrawals. Abrams was tasked with collaborating with the South Vietnamese to propose ways to improve the structure and combat abilities of the RVNAF. This led to a program known as the Midway Increase, which Laird approved on August 18, 1969. Simultaneously, Laird instructed MACV and the Joint Staff to evaluate all existing and planned programs for enhancing the RVNF. He asked them to not only focus on force structure and equipment improvements, but also to explore new strategies, tactics, leadership, and training methods suited to South Vietnamese capabilities. On September 2nd, Abrams replied to Laird's direction, clearly stating his belief that even with the Midway Increase, the proposed modernization efforts wouldn't enable South Vietnamese forces to handle the current combined threats. He highlighted issues like poor leadership, high desertion rates, and corruption at the top levels of the RVNF, expressing doubt that the South Vietnamese could be improved sufficiently, either in numbers or quality, to effectively face the challenges ahead. He firmly stated that what the Secretary of Defense expected simply couldn't be achieved within the given time frame and resources. Laird struggled to accept Abrams' evaluation, as doing so would mean acknowledging that the United States could never exit South Vietnam smoothly. This was particularly daunting, given the clear reality that the North Vietnamese were not willing to support a mutual withdrawal of both U.S. and PVN troops. On November 10th, he instructed the Joint Chiefs of Staff to devise a new strategy aimed at establishing a South Vietnamese military force capable of maintaining current security levels. He directed military planners to prepare for unilateral U.S. troop reductions, first decreasing American presence to a support force of 190,000 to 260,000 by July 1971, and later to a much smaller advisory role by July 1973. Essentially, he was urging them once again to formulate a workable Vietnamization strategy, but this time with the understanding that a significant residual U.S. support force was improbable. Meanwhile, Abrams and his team, aware of their serious doubts, recognized that the decision for U.S. withdrawal was set in motion, leading them to seek the best possible plan under Laird's firm instructions. To meet Laird's directives, military planners assumed a diminished Viet Cong threat and a declining PVN presence in the region, while largely overlooking the North Vietnamese forces stationed just outside South Vietnam's borders. Based on these questionable assumptions, MACV presented new recommendations by the end of December. In January 1970, the Joint Chiefs incorporated these assumptions into the Phase 3 RVNF Improvement and Modernization Plan, which aimed to bolster RVNF strength to 1,061,505 over 3 years, activating and equipping 10 new artillery battalions, 24 truck companies, and 6 additional helicopter squadrons. Although Laird viewed this plan as a positive development, he remained uneasy that the MACV planners had yet to accept the absence of a substantial American support force and suspected they were delaying the withdrawal. Consequently, in mid-February 1970, Laird traveled to Saigon to meet with Abrams and Thieu, emphasizing the urgency of the matter. He expressed his disappointment regarding what he saw as a lack of innovative approaches from MACV in executing the Vietnamization program. While in Saigon, he held separate meetings with senior South Vietnamese generals who voiced their concerns about the Phase 3 plan. They reiterated previous requests for extra artillery, including long-range 175mm artillery and air defense systems, and once again sought financial assistance to better support their troops. Upon returning to Washington, Laird instructed the Joint Chiefs of Staff to reassess the Phase 3 proposal, taking the South Vietnamese requests into account and formulating a more comprehensive strategy. 2 months later, the Joint Chiefs presented the revised plan, which became known as the Consolidated RVNF Improvement and Modernization Plan, or CRIMP. This initiative, covering the fiscal years from 1970 to 1972, increased the total supported South Vietnamese military force to a precise 1.1 million. CRIMP significantly impacted the entire RVNF. As before, the ARVN received the largest share of enhancements, eventually acquiring 155mm and 175mm long-range artillery, M42 and M55 anti-aircraft systems, M48 tanks, and a variety of other advanced weaponry and equipment. By the end of 1969, the U.S. had delivered 1,200 tanks and armored vehicles, 30,000 machine guns, 4,000 mortars, 20,000 radios, and 25,000 jeeps and trucks. The new equipment and arms obtained in the 2 years following CRIMP's approval enabled the ARVN to activate an additional division, the 3rd Infantry Division, along with several smaller units, which included 25 Border Ranger battalions, numerous artillery battalions, 4 armored cavalry squadrons, 3 tank battalions, 2 armored brigade headquarters, and 3 anti-aircraft battalions. By early 1972, the strength of the South Vietnamese Army would rise to 450,000, with 171 infantry battalions, 22 armored cavalry and tank squadrons, and 64 artillery battalions. The territorial, regional, and popular forces also greatly benefited from CRIMP. As Vietnamization progressed, MACV and Washington aimed to fill the void left by withdrawing U.S. divisions with an expansion of the RFPF, which was intended to assume a major role in territorial security and support for the pacification program. This expansion included a notable increase in numbers and enhanced equipment. Under the CRIMP program, the regional forces and popular forces were equipped with newer, more advanced weapons like M16 rifles, M60 machine guns, and M79 grenade launchers. These were significant upgrades compared to the mismatched old weapons they had been using before. The addition of new 105mm howitzers allowed the Joint General Staff to establish a total of 174 territorial artillery sections to support the RF, PF, and Border Ranger units. This greatly enhanced the fire support available to these territorial forces and lessened the strain on regular artillery units, enabling them to concentrate on aiding the regular maneuver battalions in their combat missions. Alongside the new gear, the troop numbers in the regional and popular forces were boosted to strengthen the government presence in the countryside for the pacification efforts. The command structure for the regional forces saw improvements, with several RF group commands being formed. The ground troops weren't the only ones to benefit from CRIMP. The Vietnamese Air Force also saw significant growth, expanding from 17,000 personnel in late 1968 to 37,000 by the end of 1969, and reaching 64,000 by 1973. This personnel increase came with substantial upgrades in aircraft and command and control capabilities. The older propeller-driven planes in the VNF began transitioning to A-37 and F-5A jet fighter bombers, enhancing their ground support capacity. Cargo capability also improved, starting with upgrades from C-47 aircraft to C-119s, and eventually to C-123 and C-7 aircraft. The helicopter fleet, managed entirely by the VNF in South Vietnam, unlike the U.S. system, where the Army held most, expanded significantly as U.S. Army aviation units redeployed, handing over their helicopters to newly formed Vietnamese squadrons. By late 1972, as the United States readied for total withdrawal, the VNAF, through a special program called Enhance Plus, acquired 32 C-130A cargo planes, additional C-7 planes, F-5A fighter bombers, and helicopters. By this time, the Vietnamese Air Force had grown to 6 times its size in 1964, operating a total of 1,700 aircraft, including over 500 helicopters, by 1973. By that point, it had developed 6 air divisions, totaling 10 A-37 fighter bomber squadrons, 3 A-1H attack helicopter squadrons, 3 F-5E fighter bomber squadrons, 17 UH-1 helicopter squadrons, 4 CH-47 helicopter squadrons, 10 liaison and observation squadrons, 3 C-7 squadrons, as well as 4 AC-47, AC-119, and EC-47 squadrons, among additional training units. When the U.S. withdrew in 1973, the VNAF had become one of the most formidable air forces in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese Navy also saw remarkable growth during this Vietnamization phase. Starting with just 17,000 personnel in 1968, it swelled to 40,000 by 1972. To boost the VNN's capabilities and fulfill the Vietnamization objectives, 2 new programs were established by MAC-V in 1969. The first, known as the Accelerated Turnover of Assets, aimed to quickly enhance naval strength and training while expediting the transfer of ships and combat responsibilities from the U.S. Navy to the South Vietnamese Navy. The second initiative, called the Accelerated Turnover of Logistics, focused on bolstering naval logistical support. In May 1969, the VNN received 2 small cruisers, and soon after, the U.S. Navy Riverine Force began handing over its vessels and river patrol duties to the VNN. By mid-1970, over 500 U.S. brownwater Navy boats had been transferred. In September of that year, the VNN took charge of the vessels and mission associated with the Market Time Coastal Interdiction Initiative. By 1972, the Vietnamese Navy had a fleet exceeding 1,700 ships and boats, including sea patrol crafts, large cargo vessels, coastal and river patrol crafts, and amphibious ships. In terms of the quantity of equipment and modern armaments, Vietnamization proved effective. By 1970, South Vietnam had made significant strides in modernization, becoming one of the largest and best-equipped military forces globally. Unfortunately, mere equipment and numbers weren't sufficient to address the challenges South Vietnam faced as it prepared to take full control of the war. Enhancing the combat readiness of the South Vietnamese armed forces was crucial. To achieve this, MAF-V placed increasing emphasis on training and advisory efforts, which had been a focus since the early days of U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. U.S. advisors were identified in 3 main roles. They worked with South Vietnamese combat units, operated at the training base, and participated in provincial pacification efforts. The MAC-V headquarters played a key advisory role to the Joint General Staff, the highest command of the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces. However, only a fraction of the MACV headquarters personnel acted in a genuine advisory capacity. In 1970, just 397 out of 1,668 authorized positions across MAFV's 15 staff agencies were officially recognized as advisors to the government of Vietnam and the JGS. As the conflict progressed and more American troops were pulled out, the role of the MAC-V staff agencies became increasingly focused on advisory tasks. Beneath the JGS were 4 South Vietnamese Corps commanders, who oversaw the 4 tactical zones, later known as military regions. Initially, their counterparts in the U.S. were the senior field force commanders in each zone. In this role, the senior U.S. commander had 2 deputies who worked closely with the South Vietnamese forces. One deputy focused on civil operations and revolutionary development support, acting as the main advisor to the ARVN Corps commander in terms of pacification and development. The other deputy served as the senior advisor to the Corps commander, leading the U.S. Army Advisory Group connected to the ARVN Corps headquarters. Together, they offered assistance, guidance, and support to the Corps commander and their team in areas like command, administration, training, combat operations, intelligence, logistics, political strategy, and civil affairs. As more U.S. units and the senior field force headquarters were withdrawn, the advisory structure evolved. From 1971 to 1972, 4 regional assistance commands were created, with the regional assistance commander, typically a U.S. Army Major General, taking over as the primary advisor to the South Vietnamese Corps commander in their respective military regions. The regional assistance commander's mission was to support the ARVN Corps commander in building and maintaining a strong military capability. This involved advising and aiding RVNF military and paramilitary commanders at all levels in areas such as military operations, training, intelligence, personnel management, and support activities. To achieve this, the Regional Assistance Commander worked closely with the ARVN Corps staff and had operational control over U.S. Army advisory groups and pacification advisory organizations in the region. His team provided guidance and support at every level of South Vietnamese command, helping to plan and execute both combat operations and pacification efforts in the region. Below the senior U.S. advisor in each military region, there were province advisory teams and division advisory teams. Each of South Vietnam's 44 provinces was led by a province chief, typically a South Vietnamese Army or Marine colonel, who oversaw the provincial government and commanded the provincial, regional, and popular forces. Launched in 1967, the CORDS program created an advisory system to help province chiefs manage the pacification program. The American counterpart to the province chief was the province senior advisor, who could be military or civilian based on the province's security situation. This advisor and their team were tasked with supporting the province chief in both civil and military aspects of the South Vietnamese pacification and development initiatives. The staff of the province senior advisor, comprising both U.S. military and civilian members, was split into two sections. One focused on area and community development, covering public health, administration, civil affairs, education, agriculture, psychological operations, and logistics. The second section concentrated on plans and operations, assisting with military operations led by the territorial forces in the province. The province chief exercised authority through the district chiefs. To support the district chiefs, the province senior advisor oversaw the district senior advisors, each managing a team of about 8 members, though the exact size varied based on local needs. These district advisory teams helped the district chief with both military and civil sides of the pacification and development program. They also provided guidance and training to the RFPFs in the district. By the end of 1967, around 4,000 U.S. military and civilian personnel were involved in the CORDS advisory effort. When Vietnamization was officially proclaimed in 1969, the U.S. Army advisory strength reached about 13,500, with half linked to CORDS. This increase resulted from the expansion of the pacification program after the 1968 Tet Offensive. Besides the CORDS teams, there were also advisory teams working with RVNF regular forces. In January 1969, Max V aimed to improve the capabilities of regular ARVN divisions by launching the Combat Assistance Team concept. This initiative focused on reducing the number of tactical advisors in the field, while shifting their role from advising to combat support coordination at the ARVN division level. The Division Combat Assistance Team's objective was to support the ARVN Division Commander and his staff in command and control, administration, training, tactical operations, intelligence, security, logistics, and certain elements of political warfare. Typically, a U.S. Army colonel led the division's senior advisor, overseeing the regimental and battalion advisory teams. Each ARVN division usually contained 3 infantry regiments, 1 artillery regiment, and several distinct battalions, including a cavalry squadron and an engineer battalion. Regimental advisory teams typically comprised between 8 and 12 U.S. Army personnel, who were eventually reduced in size as U.S. forces gradually withdrew, and were usually led by a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel with a mix of officers and non-commissioned officers. The separate battalion advisory teams generally included 1 or 2 specialists providing advice to South Vietnamese forces in their specific functional areas, such as cavalry, intelligence, engineering, and logistics. Elite ARVN troops, including airborne and ranger units, were organized similarly to regular ARVN units, with the regiment being the highest command level. Each regiment was supported by an American advisory team led by a colonel, which was larger than those attached to regular ARVN regiments. The advisory framework for the Vietnamese Marine Corps mirrored that of the ARVN, but involved advisors from the U.S. Marine Corps. U.S. advisors did not hold command or exercise operational control over South Vietnamese forces. Their role focused on providing military advice and assistance to their counterparts. The intent was for these advisory teams to gradually work themselves out of a role as the ARVN and VNMC took on more responsibility for their own operations. Alongside U.S. advisors involved with CORDS and those in the field with South Vietnamese combat units, A considerable number were also assigned to the RVNAF training base to enhance the training of South Vietnamese forces. By the end of 1972, South Vietnam was poised to possess one of the largest and most modern military forces in Southeast Asia. However, no amount of top-notch equipment mattered if the soldiers, sailors, and airmen lacked the knowledge, leadership, or motivation to effectively utilize it against the enemy. While training the Vietnamese was theoretically prioritized throughout the war, this critical function received insufficient attention before Vietnamization began. Even with the new policy, upgrading South Vietnamese training remained a significant challenge. The ARVN training system comprised 56 training centers of various types and sizes, including 9 national training centers, not accounting for the airborne and marine divisions that had their own centers, and 37 provincial training centers. This comprehensive network of schools and training facilities was overseen by the RVNAF Central Training Command, which had been established in 1966. This command received guidance and support from the MACV Training Directorate, tasked with helping develop an effective military training system for the RVNAF. The Training Directorate sent U.S. advisors to RVNF schools and training centers, where they helped RVNF commandants prepare and implement training programs. Initially, the RVNF training structure of schools and training centers in 1968 appeared impressive, but a closer look revealed it was falling short in producing the leaders and soldiers needed to effectively wage the war. MACV put forward several proposals to the Vietnamese Joint General Staff and Central Training Command aimed at enhancing the personnel capacity and efficiency of South Vietnamese training facilities. Yet these suggestions received little attention from RVNAF senior leaders. As noted in the MACV command overview, despite CTC and MACV efforts, little progress was made in 1969 in these areas due to the complex personnel changes required, JGS reluctance to prioritize the program, and RVN field commanders' refusal to release experienced officers and NCOs from operational duties. By early 1970, U.S. officials were so alarmed by the situation that the Army Chief of Staff sent a fact-finding team to Vietnam led by Brig Gen. Donnelly Bolton. This team toured RVNF training facilities to provide an unbiased assessment of the training capabilities and evaluate the state of U.S. training assistance. They found the efforts of both South Vietnamese and U.S. military training advisors to be inadequate. The MACV Training Directorate, responsible for supplying advisors to the RVNF training facilities, was only operating at 70% of its assigned strength, and all U.S. training advisory detachments in the field were similarly understaffed. The quality of advisory personnel assigned to train the South Vietnamese at RVNF schools was also concerning, as it seemed those considered unfit for more prestigious operational and staff roles were often assigned to training positions. Col. Later Major Gen. Stan L. McClellan, part of the Bolton team, remarked, "It was clear that top professionals were not being assigned to training advisory duties." General Abrams concurred with the Bolton team's findings and advised Bolton to recommend to the Joint Chiefs of Staff that more skilled training advisors be sent to Vietnam upon his return to the Pentagon. He was particularly focused on ensuring that his advisory teams were staffed with individuals at their proper rank, reducing the number of low-ranking advisors with limited combat experience. Abrams expressed to Bolton, "It's time for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington to acknowledge that the era of U.S. combat involvement in South Vietnam is over. Our priority now is to prepare South Vietnam to take on the responsibilities ahead." Simultaneously, Abrams was advocating for improvements within the RVNAF High Command's training system. In a March 1970 letter to General Cao Van Vien, the head of the Joint General Staff, he encouraged senior South Vietnamese commanders to actively support the training initiative. He stated, "We need to broaden and speed up arrangements for CTC activities. It's crucial to engage the personal interest and assistance of Corps, Divisional Tactical Area, and Sector commanders as they are key users of the training system and should help enhance the training outcomes." Thanks largely to Abrams' push and the understanding that U.S. forces would indeed be withdrawn, the RVNF High Command began prioritizing enhancements to their training framework. The U.S.'s contribution of $28 million to expand and improve South Vietnamese facilities played a significant role as well. Ultimately, this led to the establishment of 33 major military and service schools, 13 national and regional training centers, and 14 division training centers. By 1970, South Vietnamese leaders started moving experienced officers and NCOs to these training centers. Although field commanders were hesitant to release their seasoned small unit leaders, by the end of 1971, nearly half of the South Vietnamese training instructors had combat experience. By this time, the number of U.S. training advisory personnel had increased, and by the close of 1971, there were over 3,500 U.S. advisors actively engaged in training across most training centers and major RVNF schools. While South Vietnamese leaders started to recognize the need to enhance their training programs, the quality and quantity of U.S. advisors remained a challenge. This concern applied not only to advisors in the training centers, but also to advisory staff at all levels, including those working with field units and CORDS advisory teams. In December 1969, as the Vietnamization policy began to gain momentum, along with the corresponding changes in force structure, equipment, and training, Secretary Laird understood the vital role of the advisory effort in the Vietnamization process. He urged the service secretaries to consider ways to improve the overall advisory effort. Before this, many in the U.S. Army viewed advisor positions as less desirable compared to field command with a U.S. unit, leading many officers and NCOs to shy away from advisory duties. The selection process for advisors often came down to who was available for overseas duty when advisory positions opened up due to rotations or casualties. Those who were chosen for these roles received limited training, which consisted of just a 6-week course at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, followed by 8 weeks of Vietnamese language training at the Defense Language Institute. As a result, many of those designated as advisors lacked the necessary experience, training, or desire for the position. Laird aimed to change this scenario. He wanted to place the most qualified individuals in advisor roles. Initially, he faced resistance from the Army. Secretary of the Army Stanley Reser acknowledged the issue, but did not propose any concrete solutions. The Army was grappling with significant personnel issues, as the demands of the war necessitated that Army officers and non-commissioned officers return to Vietnam for multiple tours, sometimes with less than a year in between. This rising demand for advisors only intensified the strain on the personnel system. Despite these challenges, Abrams continued to advocate for a greater focus on assigning qualified, combat-experienced officers to advisory duties. He requested individuals capable of leading and influencing the effort for pacification. Officers who could empathize with the Vietnamese, recognize their strengths, and grasp their weaknesses. He sought advisors who could draw ideas and actions from the Vietnamese to achieve two primary objectives: pacification and enhancing the RVNF. Laird supported Abrams by insisting that the advisory roles be filled and instructed service secretaries to dispatch only the most qualified personnel as advisors. Eventually, the message resonated with the services, and by late 1970, there was a significant influx of top military professionals into South Vietnam's Training Advisory Initiative. The advisory mission also gained from the U.S. troop reduction, as the departure of more American units led to fewer combat roles, thus allowing many officers who would have served in U.S. units to take on advisory duties. During 1969, the total strength of field advisory teams grew from about 7,000 to 11,900, and then to 14,332 in 1970. While Abrams concentrated on enhancing the advisory initiative, President Nixon and Secretary Laird continued to advocate for quicker troop reductions. Nixon initially announced the first U.S. troop withdrawal at Midway, but he and Laird were further motivated to accelerate their withdrawal plans by former Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford. In June 1969, Clifford published an article in Foreign Affairs recommending the unilateral withdrawal of 100,000 troops by the year's end, and all other personnel by the end of 1970, leaving only logistics and Air Force staff. Nixon, always ready for a challenge, claimed at a press conference that he could do better than Clifford's timeline. This assertion attracted notable media attention and effectively committed the United States to a unilateral withdrawal from South Vietnam, removing the option of troop reductions as a bargaining tool for Kissinger in negotiations with the North Vietnamese in Paris. This would have significant implications for peace talks and the effectiveness of the eventual ceasefire agreement. The first redeployment of 25,000 U.S. troops, as promised by President Nixon, was completed by August 27, 1969, when the last troops from the 1st and 2nd Brigades of the 9th Infantry Division left the Mekong Delta. In the months after the Midway announcement, discussions continued about how many U.S. troops should be withdrawn and at what speed. Laird proposed several options for the rest of 1969, suggesting a withdrawal of 50,000 troops at the lowest and 100,000 at the highest, with various combinations in between. In a memorandum to the President, Laird warned against a hasty troop withdrawal, noting that it could severely impact the pacification program. His warning turned out to be timely. On August 6th, as troops from the 9th Infantry Division prepared to leave South Vietnam, the Communists launched an attack on Cam Ranh Bay. Just 5 days later, they struck over 100 cities, towns, and military bases throughout South Vietnam. An official North Vietnamese history later revealed that after the Midway announcement, the Politburo in Hanoi believed the U.S. had lost its will to fight in Vietnam, prompting them to escalate their attacks, feeling emboldened to dictate the level of combat. When Nixon announced the initial troop withdrawals in June, he stressed that future reductions would hinge on the level of enemy activity. These new communist assaults clearly violated that condition, leading Nixon to delay any further troop withdrawals. This decision stirred significant backlash in Congress and the media. On September 12th, the National Security Council convened to assess the situation. Kissinger noted that a natural reaction would have been to halt the troop returns, but by then, the momentum for withdrawal was strong. Just 2 days before the meeting, Kissinger sent Nixon a memo expressing his concerns about the administration's direction in South Vietnam. He cautioned that withdrawals of U.S. troops will become like salted peanuts to the American public. The more troops come home, the more will be demanded. This, he argued, could ultimately lead to calls for a unilateral withdrawal, reassuring Hanoi further as troop numbers decreased. Kissinger's prediction would prove accurate, but during the NSC meeting, he stood alone in opposing the planned troop reductions. On September 16th, Nixon directed the redeployment of an additional 35,000 American troops by December. Kissinger noted that the withdrawals became unavoidable, and from then on, the president consistently announced a new troop increment at the end of each withdrawal period. By December 15th, Nixon ordered another 50,000 troops to be redeployed before April 1970. When April 20, 1970, arrived, he revealed that while 110,000 U.S. troops were set to return during the first 3 increments, 115,000 had actually left Vietnam. The next phase of the withdrawal, running from April 1970 to April 1971, aimed to lower the total U.S. troop count by an additional 150,000. By the close of 1970, only about 344,000 U.S. troops remained in South Vietnam, as the 9th Infantry Division, the 3rd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division, the 1st Infantry Division, the 3rd Marine Division, 2 brigades of the 25th Infantry Division, and the entire 4th Infantry Division had been redeployed. With the U.S. forces preparing to leave, they halted combat operations, handing over responsibility to the RVNF in their respective areas. From the announcement of U.S. troop withdrawals in June 1969 until the end of November 1972, the U.S. returned home in 14 increments, shrinking the total troop presence in Vietnam from a high of 543,400 to a remaining force of 27,000. As the initial troop withdrawals began, the RVNF was compelled to take on greater responsibilities for the ongoing war, regardless of the progress being made in Vietnamization and pacification. This was the challenge facing General Abrams. With the conflict still intense, he had to intensify efforts to prepare the RVNF to fill the gaps left on the battlefield by departing U.S. forces. He was essentially racing against time. When Abrams took command of MACV in 1968, he recognized the urgent need to enhance the combat readiness of the South Vietnamese armed forces. Even prior to President Nixon's declaration of Vietnamization as the new U.S. strategy in South Vietnam, General Abrams had begun implementing measures to boost the effectiveness of the RVNF training base, although this had not been the historical focus of MACV's mission. Abrams had taken on the long-standing U.S. objective of engaging and defeating the Communists to compel their withdrawal from South Vietnam. When Nixon announced the Vietnamization policy and provided the new mission statement, Abrams was tasked with helping the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces take on a greater share of combat operations. His main objectives were to provide substantial assistance to strengthen the South Vietnamese forces, support the pacification efforts, and limit the supply flow to the enemy. Despite his serious concerns about the rapid withdrawal of U.S. troops, General Abrams recognized his orders and intensified efforts to enhance the combat readiness of South Vietnamese units. This challenge wasn't new to Abrams. From the moment he took command, he had worried that the American and South Vietnamese forces were effectively fighting two separate wars. He aimed to unify their roles and missions by implementing a single combined strategy, eliminating the unwelcome reality of two distinct strategies: attrition and pacification. Abrams characterized this one-war approach as a strategy focused on safeguarding the population to enable the civil government to assert its authority, in contrast to the earlier goal of simply destroying the enemy's forces. Abrams had already begun to put this effective approach into practice, but it was formalized in the MAT-CV Objectives Plan approved in March 1969. This plan was ultimately embraced by both the U.S. and Saigon as the Combined Strategic Objectives Plan, which emphasized that the RVNAF needed to be fully engaged in all types of operations to prepare for assuming full responsibility. Once the new plan was in place, Abrams set out to ensure that MACV forces completely embraced his one-war concept, thereby eliminating the divisions that had often hindered Allied efforts. By the time he received the official change of mission from President Nixon, Abrams had already begun to shift the focus of MACV. Armed with the new unified strategy and encouraged by his commander-in-chief to Vietnamize the war, he aimed to take control of the combat situation while progressively transferring the bulk of the responsibility for the war to the South Vietnamese, as U.S. troop withdrawals became more frequent and extensive. One approach he envisioned was to have the ARVN fighting alongside American troops in the field through combined operations. While American and South Vietnamese forces had engaged in joint missions before the one-war policy, the South Vietnamese typically played a supporting role on the outskirts of the main action. Many American combat leaders were hesitant to collaborate with South Vietnamese troops, often viewing the ARVN as more of a liability than an asset, seeing them as likely to create more issues than they resolved. Although the situation improved somewhat after the 1968 Tet Offensive, Abrams, tasked with accelerating the Vietnamization of the war, mandated closer collaboration between American and South Vietnamese forces. The goal was for American units to act as examples for the soldiers of Saigon by merging their operations more closely. This strategy had succeeded in South Korea and had ultimately enhanced the combat effectiveness of the Republic of Korea Armed Forces. Abrams and his advisors clearly hoped the same would apply to South Vietnam. While efforts to integrate South Vietnamese troops into the primary combat strategy proved inconsistent and varied by Corps Tactical Zone, several new initiatives were launched in line with Abrams' directives. In I Corps Tactical Zone, Gen. Richard G. Stilwell, commander of U.S. 14th Corps, collaborated closely with ARVN Commander Major Gen. Ngo Quang Truong, fully incorporating South Vietnamese units into operational plans. Operating under a combined command of U.S. and ARVN forces, the South Vietnamese worked in close coordination with the U.S. 3rd Marine Division, the 101st Airborne Division, Air Mobile, and the 1st Brigade of the 5th Infantry Division, mechanized in Quang Tri and Toi Thien provinces. After Stilwell's replacement by M.G. Melvin Zeiss later in 1969, the new leader maintained the focus on combined operations, and other U.S. forces in I Corps intensified their cooperative efforts with the ARVN. Abrams was very pleased with how the ARVN forces performed in I Corps. Later in 1969, he directed the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division to move south, shifted the remaining American combat units in the area to focus on security, and eventually brought one of the two American Marine divisions home. In 6th Corps Tactical Zone, U.S. commanders also attempted combined operations, but they had less success. Lieutenant William R. Pears, who led I Field Force, and Lieutenant Lou Lan, the commander of ARVN 2 Corps, came together to create the Pair-Off program. This initiative aimed for each ARVN unit to have a close and ongoing partnership with a U.S. unit. They were to operate together, no matter the size of the forces involved, ensuring coordination from the Corps level down to battalion and district levels. Under this program, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division and the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade collaborated with the ARVN 22nd and 23rd Infantry Divisions. Following the launch of the Pair-Off program, 3 significant joint operations took place in 2 Corps, achieving some modest success. However, this strategy didn't yield the same results as in I Corps for various reasons. Firstly, unlike I Corps, the 2 Corps-level headquarters were not located together, complicating coordination. Moreover, ARVN field commanders in 2 Corps were less eager to collaborate with U.S. forces compared to M.G. Truong and his counterparts in 1 Corps. This lack of enthusiasm hindered their motivation to learn from the Americans, which in turn affected the level of coordination and cooperation between the two forces. In 3 Corps Tactical Zone, U.S. 2 Field Force Commander Lieutenant Julian Ewell and Lieutenant Do Cao Tri, the commander of ARVN 3 Corps, launched a program called Dong Tien, or Progress Together. This program had 3 main goals: to enhance the quantity and quality of joint operations, to significantly boost the 3 key ARVN missions of pacification support, combat effectiveness, and intensified combat operations, and to improve the efficiency of crucial combat elements, especially Army aviation assets. This program promoted a continual partnership between ARVN 3 Corps and U.S. 2 Field Force units. According to this approach, when an ARVN battalion reached an adequate level of combat readiness, it was to be gradually withdrawn from the program and resume independent operations. The Dong Tien initiative had a beneficial impact on ARVN units throughout 3 Corps. The 1st U.S. and 5th ARVN Infantry Divisions collaborated closely, and their frequent joint operations prepared the ARVN Division to take over the American unit's operational area when it was redeployed in 1970. When the 5th ARVN Division relocated its command post to Bin Long Province and took control of the former Big Red 1 territory, it marked a significant milestone in the Vietnamization process. While not every joint operation was a success, they generally played a crucial role in enhancing the battlefield effectiveness of RVNF units. Consequently, they laid the groundwork for South Vietnamese commanders and troops to take on new responsibilities as more U.S. forces withdrew. Regrettably, however, these programs couldn't resolve many deep-rooted issues that plagued the RVNAF, which ultimately contributed to the collapse of the South Vietnamese regime. Growing pains for the RVNAF included a shortage of technical skills, weak staff officers, and a lack of experience in planning and carrying out large-scale combined arms operations, among other serious challenges. The leadership crisis, especially at senior levels, was at the core of all RVNAF weaknesses. This issue deeply troubled General Abrams and his senior commanders as they worked to prepare the South Vietnamese to take charge of the conflict. Initiatives like Pair-Off and Dong Tien aimed to strengthen RVNF leadership and combat capabilities, but they fell short of fully addressing the long-standing issues in the South Vietnamese framework. By late 1969, Vietnamization had made headway in various areas. The modernization effort led to all ARVN units being equipped with up-to-date gear. The advisory effort gained renewed focus, and the RVNAF training system showed signs of improvement. The redeployment of U.S. troops compelled the RVNAF to take on more responsibility, as the number of battalion-sized operations conducted by the South Vietnamese nearly doubled between 1968 and 1969. Nonetheless, the combat effectiveness of the South Vietnamese remained inconsistent at best. Some units, like the 51st ARVN Infantry Battalion, excelled against Communist forces, while others, such as the 22nd ARVN Infantry Division, struggled significantly. The 22nd had executed 1,800 ambushes in the summer of 1969, but only claimed 6 enemy kills. The Massey V Office of Information highlighted the growing involvement of RVNAF, asserting that South Vietnamese forces would eventually be able to operate independently. Nevertheless, many advisors believed that the South Vietnamese still relied too heavily on U.S. support and were concerned about their capacity to sustain the war on their own once American troops left. While the MAFV's public relations were accurate in suggesting that time was needed for South Vietnamese forces to gain independence, the pressing question was whether there was enough time before the U.S. withdrawal was completed. Vietnamization faced its initial challenge in the spring of 1970, when Nixon authorized an incursion into North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia. This operation involved 32,000 American soldiers alongside 48,000 South Vietnamese troops. Key assaults in the Fishhook area were executed by elements from the 1st Cavalry Division, the 25th Infantry Division, and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, while South Vietnamese forces targeted the Parrot's Beak. Both operations achieved significant success, uncovering and destroying numerous large communist base camps and seizing a remarkable stockpile of supplies, including over 16 million rounds of ammunition, 45,000 rockets, nearly 2,900 individual weapons, 2,500 crew-served weapons, 5,500 landmines, 62,000 grenades, 14 million pounds of rice, and 435 vehicles. The South Vietnamese forces, primarily under the command of Lum Gen Do Cao Tri, and supported by U.S. artillery, tactical air, and helicopter gunships, performed admirably, completing all assigned tasks. Nixon heralded the South Vietnamese performance in Cambodia as clear evidence of the success of Vietnamization. However, the reality was somewhat different than he wished to acknowledge. Many of the South Vietnamese units involved in the operation were elite troops rather than typical forces. Additionally, there had been little fierce fighting in the ARVN sector because most communist soldiers fled when the Allied forces began their invasion. However, South Vietnamese artillery continued to struggle in providing necessary support for their own troops, leading ARVN commanders to rely heavily on U.S. firepower. As a result, the portrayal of South Vietnamese capabilities that Nixon sought to convey was somewhat deceptive. The considerable deficiencies within the RVNF became clear the following year when Operation Lam Son 719 was launched to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail and deny the North Vietnamese safe havens. The specific aim of this operation was to target several base areas along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, close to Military Region 1. This time, while U.S. air support was involved, American ground troops were not allowed to cross the border, which meant South Vietnamese forces would have to proceed on their own without U.S. units or advisors. The assault along Highway 9 into Laos began at 700 on February 8th and initially progressed fairly well, with the South Vietnamese securing their early goals. However, they soon became stalled along the highway. At the same time, North Vietnamese reinforcements quickly arrived, leading to a major battle that continued for another month. Although some South Vietnamese soldiers fought bravely, many others performed poorly or fled in fear. The operation concluded with ARVN units retreating back across the border in chaos. U.S. reports indicated South Vietnamese losses amounted to 3,800 killed in action, 5,200 wounded, and 775 missing. Nixon attempted to present a positive spin on the situation, but the reality was that South Vietnamese forces had not fared well on their own. Without U.S. ground support and their American advisors, they struggled to contend with the North Vietnamese regulars in direct combat. Lam Son 719 revealed that Vietnamization had not been the success Nixon had claimed, and that the enhancement of South Vietnamese forces was still very much ongoing. U.S. and South Vietnamese military leaders worked diligently to rebuild ARVN morale and confidence following the setbacks in Laos. Training programs were ramped up, and new equipment was distributed to replace what had been lost during the Lam Son operation. Meanwhile, the withdrawal of U.S. troops continued steadily. By January 1972, only 158,000 American soldiers were left in South Vietnam, marking the lowest figure since 1965. The North Vietnamese closely monitored these withdrawals and felt it was the right moment to fully test Vietnamization. While they recognized that Nixon's Vietnamization policy had somewhat bolstered the South Vietnamese military, they believed that the U.S. military presence wasn't strong enough to stop a South Vietnamese collapse if Hanoi initiated a fresh offensive. Consequently, the Politburo in Hanoi ordered a large-scale invasion of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese assault began on March 30th, 1972, as 3 divisions crossed the demilitarized zone into Quang Tri and Hue. Just 3 days later, 3 additional divisions emerged from sanctuaries in Cambodia and advanced into Bin Long province, which lay only 65 miles from Saigon. More North Vietnamese forces also attacked from Cambodia into the Central Highlands toward Kon Tum. In total, 14 NVA infantry divisions and 26 separate regiments, about 120,000 troops along with roughly 1,200 tanks and other armored vehicles, took part in this offensive, marked by large-scale infantry tactics supported by tanks and significant artillery fire and rocket strikes. This level of warfare was something the South Vietnamese had rarely faced. Initially, they were nearly completely overwhelmed. South Vietnamese forces in Quang Tri retreated from the North's fierce assault, abandoning the city and fleeing southward. In places like An Loc and Kon Tum, ARVN soldiers managed to perform better, but still endured horrific casualties due to the North Vietnamese attacks. The fighting continued across South Vietnam as summer approached. Thanks to U.S. advisors and American air support, the South Vietnamese held on and ultimately triumphed, even reclaiming Quang Tri in September. Nixon declared the Vietnamization effort a tremendous success. However, there were numerous indicators that suggested otherwise. While the South Vietnamese had managed to withstand the North Vietnamese offensive, it had been a close call that could have gone either way. They had fought valiantly in many instances, but in others they had not. General Abrams remarked that it was American air power and not South Vietnamese arms that led to the North Vietnamese defeat. Nevertheless, Nixon and his team celebrated the notion that South Vietnam's victory showed Vietnamization had worked. Jeffrey Kimball notes that Nixon needed Vietnamization to succeed, and because he did, he wanted to believe it could. Thus, for better or worse, Vietnamization was officially considered a success, and the South Vietnamese victory became a key reason for the complete U.S. withdrawal and Nixon's pursuit of peace with honor. While fighting persisted in South Vietnam, Henry Kissinger was busy negotiating a peace agreement in Paris. By fall 1972, Kissinger and North Vietnam's chief negotiator, Le Duc Tho, were close to reaching an agreement, but by December, they hit a deadlock again. When the North Vietnamese walked away from the talks, Nixon initiated what became known as the Christmas bombing. Starting on December 18th for 11 days, U.S. B-52s, F-105s, F-4s, F-111s, and A-6s attacked targets throughout North Vietnam, dropping over 40,000 tons of bombs. Not long after, the North Vietnamese returned to the negotiating table. Kissinger and Tho finally reached a deal, and at 8 a.m. Saigon time on January 28th, the ceasefire took effect. Under this agreement, the United States committed to stop all its military activities against the territory of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and remove remaining American troops, including advisors, from South Vietnam within 60 days. U.S. forces left South Vietnam as promised, with the final troops departing Saigon on March 29, 1973. On that day, the last 61 American POWs held by the North Vietnamese were released. Vietnamization was definitively over. America was out of Vietnam. Sadly for the South Vietnamese, the Paris Accords did not account for the more than 100,000 North Vietnamese troops still in South Vietnam. The ceasefire was short-lived, and combat resumed as both sides sought to seize as much territory as possible. Throughout 1973 and much of 1974, North and South Vietnamese forces clashed all over the region. Nixon had pressured Thieu to accept the Paris Accords, assuring him that the United States would assist the South Vietnamese if North Vietnam launched another major offensive. With this assurance, and armed with weapons and equipment stockpiled during 1972, the South Vietnamese were initially able to hold their ground against the North Vietnamese. As the situation deteriorated, Thieu found himself without allies. Nixon, consumed by the Watergate scandal, was struggling to save his presidency and showed little concern for the South Vietnamese struggles. On August 9, 1974, Nixon stepped down from office. Thieu and his people had long relied on Nixon's assurances of support if the North Vietnamese breached the ceasefire, but now those assurances evaporated. Gerald Ford, Nixon's successor, stated that the commitments made by the U.S. would still be honored under his administration. However, this was a promise Ford could not fulfill, given the mood in Congress. When the North Vietnamese launched a limited attack on Phuoc Long province, the South Vietnamese forces faltered, resulting in a devastating defeat that left 3,000 soldiers dead or captured and allowed the North Vietnamese to seize substantial military supplies, ultimately taking over the province. The U.S. remained inactive, shocking both Saigon and Hanoi. Thieu finally understood that his troops were engaged in a poor man's war, while the North Vietnamese, continuously supplied by China and the Soviet Union, grew stronger every day. Seizing the moment, the North Vietnamese devised a 2-year plan, anticipating that the U.S. would not intervene. They aimed for large-scale offensives in 1975 to set the stage for a general uprising in 1976. On March 10, 1975, they launched their offensive with an attack on Ban Mae Thuot in the Central Highlands, capturing the city in just 2 days before moving on to Pleiku and Kon Tum. Realizing they had been abandoned, the South Vietnamese forces panicked and began to retreat. Thieu attempted to consolidate his troops by pulling them back from the highlands in what was meant to be a strategic maneuver, but it quickly descended into chaos. As communist forces advanced from the highlands toward the coast, additional troops surged southward from Quang Tri. One by one, coastal cities and military bases fell. The communists swept down the coast, and on April 30, 1975, their tanks broke through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, marking the end of the war. The demoralized South Vietnamese forces fell apart in less than 55 days. Vietnamization faced its ultimate failure. Ultimately, Vietnamization served as a convenient cover for the U.S. departure from South Vietnam, yet it was an incomplete strategy that did not achieve its main goal of empowering the South Vietnamese to defend themselves post-withdrawal of American troops. This goal was always based on ongoing U.S. support, and America's failure to uphold that promise led to South Vietnam's collapse. Whether Nixon and Laird sought merely a decent interval or genuinely believed Vietnamization would succeed in preparing the South Vietnamese is debatable. Both Nixon and Kissinger later claimed the strategy would have worked if Congress hadn't cut off aid. However, Jeffrey Kimball disputes such statements, arguing that Nixon's policies unnecessarily extended the war, causing extensive death, destruction, and division for both Vietnam and America. Reflecting on what might have been, as Lewis Sorley notes, there are many unanswered questions. However, it is evident that the performance of the South Vietnamese forces in 1975 showcased the serious flaws in Nixon's exit strategy, especially in implementation. When North Vietnam launched its offensive in December 1974, the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces, which had once held strong under immense pressure with U.S. backing in 1972, found themselves abandoned and struggled badly in a fight that was literally for their nation's survival. The South Vietnamese lost the war on the battlefield, yet this doesn't absolve the United States of its significant responsibility for the failure. Despite progress in getting the South Vietnamese ready to take charge of the war, the U.S. hurried to sign the Paris Peace Accords, leaving over 150,000 North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. Later, when North Vietnam attacked and the U.S. didn't fulfill Nixon's commitments, it sealed the fate of the South Vietnamese armed forces. The Army, heavily reliant on U.S. firepower and support, lost its resolve and couldn't fight independently when that support was withdrawn. Despite the extensive resources spent to prepare them for self-defense, they were left glaringly unprepared once the U.S. stepped back. It's possible that the outcome could have been different if the United States had insisted on the removal of North Vietnamese troops from South Vietnam in 1973 and had continued to provide long-term support, similar to what was given to the forces in South Korea. However, that did not happen. Ultimately, Vietnamization, alongside the flawed peace accords and the failure of the U.S. to uphold commitments from two presidents, turned out to be an inadequate exit strategy. It removed the United States from Vietnam, but did not secure the future of its ally in Saigon. In the end, Nixon's strategy failed to bring peace to South Vietnam or honor to the United States. The result was that the United States lost its first war in history, and the Republic of South Vietnam disappeared as an independent nation.